Hi, I'm Corey Walmsley. I'm the CEO of Aurora Borealis Publishing House. And I wanted to address something today that I've had a lot of questions about. Because people are telling personal stories, sometimes you end up wondering how much you need to share about specific people, specific events, specific places. And that's enough sometimes to keep people from sharing their story at all. But there are a few things that you need to look at first before you decide if it's okay to share about those things. So, first of all, look at how they're going to appear in the book. And I mean, will they be painted in a good light or will they be painted in a bad light? Will they look like a decent person? Will they look like a villain? Will they look like they did something bad? Um, those are things that you have to consider up front, because if you are painting somebody as a bad guy, a villain, someone who did something wrong, then that is an entirely different situation than if you are talking about somebody who did something that most people would approve of. So you really have to start out with your own discretion. Now, let's say you're talking about your parents, and let's say it's something that was pretty benign. My parents used to drop me off at school in the morning. They'd pick me up and take me to soccer. My parents enrolled me in piano lessons. My parents were very supportive during my high school years, even though it was really tough. Stuff like that, it's not going to matter. It's going to be okay. Nobody's going to be like, why would your parents support you? Right? They're not going to yell at you. They're not going to be upset with your parents. You haven't painted anybody in a bad light. So if you want to mention those sort of things about a person, it's perfectly okay. If you have an employer, same thing. If you're talking about somebody who was a really good boss, if you're talking about a company that you worked at that you had a really good experience, all of those things are perfectly fine. Okay, so put that category aside. If it's a good experience, if something good happened, if it's a nice thing you want to report, all of that's fine. Now, unfortunately, the category we're usually dealing with is stuff that is a little more difficult. An employer that wasn't that great, a situation at school that led to a problem, a situation at work that led to a problem, maybe a bad relationship, maybe a difficult relationship with your parents. All of those things really happen in the real world, and those are big stories that we want to write about. So, how do we address that? First, I want you to look at whether those people can kind of be brought to a level where they're very generic. Now, if you're talking about something that happened 50 years ago at school, you can probably just say one of my classmates. You can probably say one of the faculty members. You can make it very generic, and nobody's going to say, I remember it was Mrs. Miller. She did this. They're not going to say that. Their chances are not even going to be reading the book if they know about that situation. They're typically not going to be your audience. If you're saying that something happened, at work, same sort of thing. You want to make it very, non-accusatory. You don't want to say, I worked for this corporation and all of these things happened. Well, if there's a lawsuit, if it's something that was out in the media, then it's okay to talk about it because it's already public record. But if it's not, like I worked with a client who her story had actually been part of a lawsuit, and the person who she was battling against ended up going to jail. His name was in the public eye for quite a while, and that was several years ago. People still know that name. So it was okay for her to mention him in her book. All of that was public knowledge. However, if it had been a personal dispute, she wouldn't have been able to bring up his name. She wouldn't have been able to go into some of the details, perhaps, because she would want to make sure that nobody was able to identify him and say, yes, you did this, because you don't want to have somebody come back and say, hey, defamation, you just wrote about me in your book and called me an a-hole. You don't want that sort of thing. So if it's a situation where, obviously if it's in the public, yes, it's okay to go ahead and talk about it if you're comfortable. It's okay to name names if you're comfortable. You don't have to. If it's something not in the public, and this is, again, we're narrowing down here. If it's something not in the public eye, something that hasn't been a lawsuit, it hasn't gone to trial, these aren't things that everybody has common knowledge of, then you may get into a stickier situation. I spoke with somebody who had a certain employer that totally screwed them over. Yeah, you can't mention that employer. Well, you also have to look at things like, are the key players in this story still alive? If it's something that happened a long time ago, they might not be. If it's something that is more recent, if key players are alive, if it's something that would be very easy to say, oh yeah, you're talking about this, then you really have to watch how you're talking about it. You want to make sure that if possible, you are not being accusatory. You don't want anybody to come back and say, this is a defamation, this is libel, any of that kind of stuff. I am not a lawyer. I am not a lawyer, but I do advise that people avoid those kind of things. You really don't want a lawsuit. So things like that are really important to think about when you're writing your book. And I'm not going to say, do not write your book. I'm going to say, how can we work around this in a way that will let you tell the story, be truthful about it, help people, impact the world, all of that kind of stuff, but also not make that person look like an a-hole. So those are some things to think about. And if you're working on your story, that is absolutely something that we talk about up front, because I don't want you to publish something that's going to come back and bite you. I don't want you to get in trouble. I don't want you to have any issues on your hands. I want you to make sure that you can reach that audience and be as impactful as you want to be. So if you're thinking about a book and this is a question that you have, let me know. Let's talk about it. Let's see how we can help you get over this hump so it's not preventing you from writing your book, so you can actually get it out to the world and be that impactful author that you've wanted to be.